Most of the experiments, as you can see here, are usually documented and filmed. However, as you can see on screen, on the scrap logs, there is one experiment that involved an E2 class locomotive. The E1-1s were actually welded tank locomotives that had two sets of 6 small wheels, consisted of being the branch line express engine both in freight, passenger, and mixed traffic. While those were a success, the E2-1s were starting to come in. Now, obviously, the wheel alignment for them was a bit off for starters. This experiment consisted of a, like I said, E2 and an E1 class locomotive of Viland. Welded parts together was actually one of the dangerous things that people has ever seen so far. But nonetheless, it worked. It wasn't until the E2-2s started to roll in. The tank engine experimentation era began after the diesels have been decommissioned for usage, debuting all the way back to 1900. This is the first step of a motivational transportation needs, steam locomotives alike. I have found these logs, starting off with this one. The E2-2 prototype was the first one to ever be started to run in. The locomotive itself was huge, had 12 small wheels on each side. I'm just kidding. But it actually did have 24 sets of wheels. The cab was long and big, bigger than the E2-1s. While these classes were known to pull a lot more significant hauling needs for freight services, they were also put into work of other duties of engines. For example, they actually drove throughout the towns while they were in high steam operation. They couldn't really take tight corners, to hence why the branch line actually didn't need them as much unless they arrived at the yards. After arrival of the yards, they would actually flip around and turn back to where they came. Their main missions were running on the branch lines and shunting, and as well as running the main line mainly. That's where you could find them. However, unfortunately, due to with this problem, not a lot of people actually know a lot about these steam locomotives, that no one had idea of what's going to happen of today's society. Unfortunately, there was one incident such that led towards to its scrapping for the prototype. While the other successors came from there, the E2-2 prototype, also known as Zero, was the only engine that actually had mechanical failures due to of its being overuse. The E2-1s were never meant to run that long, just like the E2-2s. But the E2-2s were the only ones that ran on the railway so magnificently well that it almost pulled about a weight ton of a big boy and a Grant combined. However, due to with this configuration failure with the prototype, they decided to scrap it. But obviously, before they could scrap it, they still needed to make sure that the log book was full. As it turned out, it still had 10 more loads to fulfill before its scrapping. As the journey began in 1910, it was a long, great haul. It still had 10 more passenger trains that needed to run that afternoon. However, it was still pulling freight trains in the morning. But unfortunately, the freight train was a bit too much. With its policy, the E2s were the only ones that were ever going to run as well. The train was starting to puff up the tracks like it was no tomorrow, but it wasn't until the tragedy struck. In 1910, the train was pulling its own weight. The engineers were humming down the tracks late one night, when all of a sudden they came across a point. They tried to slow down so they could alert the guard, but unfortunately, the brakes had malfunctioned in the process, causing the E22 Prototype 0 fly down the track as fast as it could. Not only it was going so fast, but it was also deadly. It was carrying not only normalized items, but they were also carrying some explosives for the mines. Unfortunately, when the branch viaduct was not even finished yet, the locomotive itself trampled on the tracks like it was nothing. The train accelerated up to speed in no time. The engineer and the fireman fiddled with the controls. The brake van manager was also inside, trying to scramble for the brakes. Unfortunately, it was no use. Unfortunately, though, after the train's collision, after it puffed down the lines, the locomotive was blown up into smithereens. The branch line was open throughout the 1911 all the way up towards the Great Depression in the Roaring '20s. Viaduct branch was no longer in need of service anymore because of the lack of money and low of income. But none of the staff can find out why. However, there was one thing that stand out in this log out of the very next. This says that ever since the viaduct and tracks were laid, a locomotive was roaring down the track, polar opposite of the main line running express train. However, though, due to with this run of the locomotive, there was nothing they could do. The train shrieked as it turned onto the tracks, only making it across halfway before disappearing, and the loads that later followed. Not only that, but the people that have seen it on the branch line also can see the horror it left upon. After this, Viland Pacific later shut it down, that particular branch line, and left it abandoned in 1921, 10 years after it was opened to the public. However, due to with this, the locomotive itself was no longer a threat, but it still roars throughout the night. For those that have seen the locomotive and notice the lights have gone red, that's why. However, the body still needed to be recovered, but due to with the tracks overlay and how bad it was, there was nothing that the people could do except just to stand there and wait. End of log 1.